Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be covering how to use all of the different autopilot modes that are available in the IniBuilds A310. If you're struggling to know when to push or pull all of the different autopilot buttons in this airplane, or you just want to have a better idea about how all the different modes work and when to use them, make sure to stick around because this video is going to be for you. It can be hard to fiddle with the autopilot controls once you're airborne, so I actually like to set up a bunch of things right before takeoff. The knobs on the FCU are a little bit confusing if you're used to flying a modern airliner, because you can either push or pull on all of the knobs for the auto throttle, the altitude hold, the heading, and the vertical speed, but the modes work completely differently from what you'd find in the A320. One rule of thumb that I find makes it really easy to remember how the autopilot works, especially for the four knobs right at the center, is that if you're pressing up on any of them, you're actually going to be configuring something for that mode. Whereas if you're pulling down on it, you're actually going to be enabling that mode. I'll show you what I mean as I'm setting up the autopilot. I'm going to be taking off from runway 1 in Las Vegas today, so the first thing I'm going to do is set my heading bug to be on the same heading as the runway. Like that, if something unexpected happens and I need to very quickly hand off to the autopilot, I can just switch it on and the airplane is automatically just going to keep flying my runway heading for me while I figure out what I've got to do next. Next, I'm going to set my initial climb altitude. When I'm flying offline, I'll usually use 10,000 feet for this, but if you're flying online, you might be given a very different altitude and you'd want to put that into your altimeter number. I'm also going to enable profile and nav mode now. Nav mode tells the airplane to follow the flight plan that I've got programmed into the box already, and for 99% of the flight I'll just be flying with nav mode on, and it's just going to bring me and sequence me from one waypoint to the other all the way to my arrival. Choosing profile means that the plane is going to decide what airspeed and how quickly it gets to the cruise altitude that I've set, and I find it works best when you pair it with the auto throttle mode, which I'm going to look at in just a sec. The airspeed needs to be set to the V2 speed that was calculated on the EFB when you were setting up your flight. Like that, if there is a failure as you're climbing out and you lose one engine, the airplane is automatically going to try and fly an airspeed that's going to keep it at a safe airspeed where it can continue to climb and fly with just a single engine. With all of that set, I'm now going to line up and get ready for takeoff. While I'm moving into position, you can just see on the primary flight display that the different modes of the autopilot that I've enabled are being shown right at the top. The top line, which is in green, is the currently active modes. In this case, I just started up the airplane, so that's just the modes it came with once I booted everything up. And just below that, you can see in blue is the next mode that's going to become active. In this case, it says that profile, climb, and nav are going to be the next vertical and lateral modes that it's going to go into, and they'll become active once I turn on the autopilot. For takeoff, I'm going to spool the engines up to about 50%, and then I'm going to press the magic auto throttle button, which is just on the left, and at that point the throttle levers are now under computer control, even though the autopilot isn't on yet. You can see on the autopilot panel that auto throttle is enabled because there's a little green light in the box, and I'm actually going to leave this on pretty much the whole flight, almost all the way till I'm on short final, just because it keeps things a lot simpler. I typically hand fly the airplane up to 5,000 feet, but I'll turn Autopilot 1 on now just because it's going to make it a little bit easier to demonstrate all the different autopilot modes. For starters, you can see the moment that I turned Autopilot 1 on, the active modes in the autopilot have changed, and it now says that I am in profile throttle and profile climb and nav mode, which means the plane is controlling my vertical and lateral guidance. The advantage of turning the autopilot on early like I have now is that it frees me up to go through the climb checklist to make sure I didn't forget something important, like say raising the flaps, which may have happened the first time I tried to record this flight. I've skipped forward a little bit and I've leveled off at 10,000 feet now. At this point, I need to increase my altitude to get to my cruise altitude, but if I were to start turning the altitude knob now, it's going to increment in 100-foot increments. I need to get all the way up to 24,000 feet, so if I actually press up on the knob and I start turning it, you're going to see that it's now incrementing in increments of 1,000 feet instead of 100, and if I want to go back to 100 feet, I just press up on the dial again to go back to it. Instead of using profile climb for this next segment, I'm actually going to use level change, which is the same thing as an open climb in the A320 if you're familiar with that. With level change, you control your climb rate by adjusting your airspeed. A lower airspeed is going to result in a higher climb rate, and a higher airspeed is going to result in a lower climb rate. In the PFD, you can see once I went to level change that it turned the active mode to speed, which is telling me that basically I'm controlling the climb rate of the airplane with the speed that I'm choosing. As I get close to 20,000 feet, you can see that the next mode that it's going to want to go into is alt mode, which is going to be the altitude hold mode. As you get close to it though, you're going to notice that before it goes to alt mode, it's going to go to something called alt star mode. The alt star basically means that it's captured the altitude that you want to get to, but it's not actually at it yet. So once I hit 20,000 feet, that's when the star is going to disappear and I'm just going to be in alt mode. You can also use vertical speed mode to control your climb, but I tend to only use that one on descent. For the most part, I'll be using profile mode to climb as well as level change if I feel I need to get up to my cruise altitude faster. We're going to get back to the video here in just a second, but I do want to remind you to hit the like button if you haven't already and consider subscribing as well. I publish a new video every 2 weeks with tips, tricks, and tutorials for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and your support helps to keep the channel growing. Now that I'm at cruise, I want to show you a little bit about heading mode. It's just like you'd find in a general aviation airplane. First, you can sync it to your heading by pressing up on the dial, and then you can go into that mode by pressing the heading select button right below it. There's also a little switch right behind the knob where you can set your current heading that you're flying. It's got two values, norm and 15. That's the bank angle that the plane is going to use when you're changing your course in heading mode. If I change my course with it set to the norm value, you're going to see it uses a pretty steep turn to get to whatever heading I told it to turn to. This is what you need to use when you're maneuvering around either at takeoff or landing with heading select mode, but at cruise altitude you can actually make your turns a little bit less steep by switching it to 15. 15 is the number of degrees that it's going to use for all your turns, and you can see that as I'm turning back towards my initial course here, that turn is a lot less steep than what I was doing when I was in norm mode. I'm going to switch it back to nav mode now, and the interesting thing to note is that nav mode ignores this setting, but that being said, make sure to put it back to norm before you come in to land if you do decide to use it, just because if you're trying to make turns with heading select as you're coming in on approach, you're going to struggle to make those turns at only 15 degrees of bank. Alright, it's now time to look at how to descend with the autopilot. Just like for the climb, I'm going to use profile mode, which is going to let the airplane decide the airspeed and descent rate that it uses. There's an added bonus to using profile mode as well. If there are restrictions along the route, which there almost always are when you're descending, profile mode is automatically going to follow them. For example, you can see I'm descending towards the Jackie waypoint right now, and it's a little bit small on the primary flight display, but there's an altitude restriction of 17,000 to 19,000 feet, and since I'm using profile mode, it's automatically going to stay within that restriction. Profile mode can be a little bit slow to get going though, and you might actually think it's not going to descend on time, but I found in general, if you let it do its thing, that it's going to work out quite well. If you want to get down faster than what profile mode is giving you though, you can switch into level change mode, which is going to do an open descent just like in the A320. You control the descent rate once you switch to level change mode by adjusting the airspeed with the airspeed knob. In this case though, a lower airspeed is going to result in a lower descent rate, and a higher airspeed is going to result in a steeper descent rate. The other thing to know about level change is it will not respect altitude restrictions like profile mode does. I've just gone by the gray waypoint right now, which has a restriction of 12,000 feet, but as you can see, level change just blew right through it. So if you do decide to use level change, what I suggest is to set the target altitude in the autopilot to be the restriction of the next waypoint, and just keep dialing it down as you go by each waypoint to the restriction of the following one. Restrictions are there for a reason, either to manage inbound and outbound traffic from the airport, or to make sure that you're well clear of any obstacles like any mountains that might be in the way, like on the flight that I'm doing today from Vegas to Ontario. So you have to make sure that you follow those restrictions regardless of what autopilot mode you're using. One last trick that you can use to increase your descent rate is to extend the speed brakes. They'll help burn off a little bit of airspeed, which means you'll be able to get just a little bit more vertical speed out of the airplane. You'll want to make sure to be at or below 250 knots as you go through 10,000 feet, and I like to be at about 180 knots as I get close to starting my approach, so I keep driving that speed down as much as possible. I switched to vertical speed mode around this point as well, just because it gives me a little bit finer control over my descent rate, and I can use the vertical deviation that's shown in the navigation display to tell how high or low I am relative to the ideal glide path. To go into vertical speed mode, all I do is pull down on the vertical speed dial, and then I can turn the dial down to whatever descent rate that I want. I'll usually start off with about 1,000 feet per minute, and I'll adjust accordingly based on what the vertical deviation indicator is doing. The vertical deviation diamond works exactly like the glide slope does. Your goal is to try and keep it right at the center of the gauge on the line that's right there. And if you see it go higher, what you need to do is shallow up your descent rate. And if you see it go lower, you need to increase your descent rate with the vertical speed. Alright, so I am flying an ILS approach today, and the first thing I'm going to do for that is I'm going to switch into ILS mode, and you're going to see that the localizer and the glide path information are now displayed on the primary flight display. At this point, I can press the VL button, which is going to tell the plane that it should intercept the localizer path, which is still a little bit ahead of me. You can see lock is shown in blue as the next active mode in the PFD, but once it acquires the signal, it's going to go into lock star mode, and it's at that point that I'm going to switch into land mode on the autopilot panel so that the plane also intercepts the glide slope of the ILS. So now you can see that my active modes are localizer and glide slope, which means that the airplane is intercepting both, and it's going to descend for me and stay on the right path to continue towards the runway. And all I need to worry about now is to continue driving down that airspeed. If you're flying an ILS approach and you're flying into some really bad weather, what you can also do is turn on AP2 at this point, which is going to make the approach go from a Cat 2 approach to a Cat 3 approach. By doing this, the plane is automatically going to fly itself all the way down to the runway and even flare for you, although you still have to extend flaps and landing gear yourself. On clear days like today though, I like to hand fly the plane down, so I'm going to disable autopilot 1 and 2 at this point. However, you're going to notice that when I do that, the plane is still going to keep doing that beep beep noise at me. The reason for that is because you need to disconnect it on the yoke itself by pressing on the red button, and that'll shut it up once and for all. Although I've disabled the autopilot, the auto throttle is still on, so if I wanted, I could just dial my speed down to my final approach speed, which in this case is 130 knots if I remember correctly, and the plane would just handle that for me even though the autopilot is off. The only thing to be aware of if you do decide to leave auto throttle on is that you need to make sure to bring your throttles back to idle before touching down. If you don't, when you do touch down, the airplane is going to start beeping and screaming at you, so you can still do it at that point, I guess, but it's better to do it beforehand. In my case, I like to disable the auto throttle on short file. I'm going to do that now, but before that, I usually have a look to see what the N1 is on both engines. I'm going to adjust my throttles to be at about the same percentage so that when I disable the auto throttle, there isn't a large variation in the amount of power that the engine wants to develop. And with all of that done, I'm now in complete control of the airplane, be it from a vertical, lateral, or even power point of view. So if I screw up the landing, it is entirely on me. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and also let me know if you'd like to see more videos around the A310, and if there are any topics in particular that you'd like to see covered. I'd be happy to get your feedback. And if you've made it to this point in the video, make sure that you've hit the like button if you haven't already, and subscribe as well so that you don't miss out on the next one.